The town of Greenfield sat quietly between the hills, its narrow streets lined with white picket fences, and the air carried the scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens. Life moved slowly in Greenfield, with people often exchanging smiles as they went about their day. In a town like this, everyone knew each other, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Until Sarah Matthews arrived. She was a familiar face, her charm and warmth drawing attention wherever she went. Sarah had lived in Greenfield her whole life, and despite her beauty and the whispers of admiration behind her back, she had always managed to maintain a low profile. She spent her days working as a teacher at the local elementary school, known for her patience and kindness. Parents adored her, children respected her, and there was no reason to suspect anything but the best from Sarah. Her friends often marveled at her calm demeanor, always poised and pleasant, someone who seemed to have it all together. Then, 6 months ago, everything changed. Sarah met Daniel Rivers at a charity event in a neighboring town. Daniel, a successful architect with a sharp intellect and undeniable charm, seemed like the perfect match for Sarah. He was tall, confident, and had a way of commanding attention in a room without saying a word. Their chemistry was undeniable from the moment they met. Friends of Sarah's couldn't help but notice the sparkle in her eyes when she spoke of him. And for the first time in years, it was clear to everyone around her that she was truly in love. The whirlwind romance that followed felt like a dream come true. Daniel's career had taken him all over the world, and his wealth made him a figure of admiration. He had a charming smile and an aura of success, and he seemed to adore Sarah completely. Their connection grew quickly, and soon they were inseparable. Daniel proposed to Sarah at the top of a mountain on a snowy evening, the stars above them twinkling as brightly as their future seemed to be. It was the kind of proposal that would be remembered for years. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Sarah's excitement was contagious. Greenfield was abuzz with the news of her engagement, and the townsfolk eagerly awaited the celebration. The wedding itself was nothing short of magical. The ceremony took place in a beautiful vineyard just outside of town, the rows of grapevines forming a perfect backdrop as Sarah walked down the aisle. She wore a stunning white gown, and Daniel, standing at the altar, couldn't take his eyes off her. It was the kind of wedding that seemed ripped from a fairy tale, filled with laughter, love, and promise. That night, after the reception, the newlyweds checked into a secluded hotel on the outskirts of Greenfield. The location was chosen for its privacy and beauty, a charming hotel nestled on the edge of a vast forest with sweeping views of the hills. It was the perfect setting for the start of their life together. As they entered the room, decorated with rose petals and soft lighting, there was an undeniable sense of anticipation. The wedding had been perfect, but the real adventure, they believed, was about to begin. The night was still young, the air crisp, and everything seemed perfect. Sarah and Daniel were about to share their first night as husband and wife, something many had dreamed of their entire lives. But beneath the excitement, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the wedding or Daniel. He was everything she had hoped for. It was an unsettling thought creeping through her mind like an ominous whisper she couldn't quite hear clearly. Was it just nerves, or was something darker waiting to reveal itself? It was a feeling she couldn't escape, one that lingered in the back of her mind as the night stretched on. By morning, the peaceful serenity that had surrounded the wedding night was shattered. The sun had barely begun to rise over the distant hills, casting a soft golden light on the hotel's exterior when the first responders arrived at the scene. A hotel staff member had found Sarah standing outside the door to her room, trembling and covered in blood. She was in a state of shock, her eyes wide with terror, her hands shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. Inside the room, Daniel Rivers was dead. His body lay sprawled across the floor, lifeless and still, his face contorted in the unmistakable expression of someone who had struggled in the final moments of their life. The scene was chaotic. A violent struggle had taken place, evidenced by the overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the bloodstains that smeared the walls and floor. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had broken in. The only person in the room when the tragedy occurred had been Sarah. The police arrived soon after, and Sarah was immediately questioned. Her answers were frantic, her words barely coherent. She claimed that she had no idea what had happened. She said that they had gone to bed after a night of celebration, but when she woke up, Daniel was dead. She insisted that she hadn't heard anything in the night, hadn't seen anyone come in, and hadn't been aware of any danger. She spoke of being so exhausted from the wedding that she fell into a deep sleep, only to wake up to find herself covered in blood, with Daniel lying lifeless beside her. Despite her clear distress, the investigators were cautious. Something didn't add up. If Sarah was truly innocent, why had she been found alone outside the room looking so calm and composed when the authorities arrived? Why was there no phone call for help, no frantic attempts to alert anyone? When questioned further, Sarah explained that her phone was missing. She couldn't remember what happened to it, but the room was so disheveled, she assumed it had been misplaced during the struggle, yet her explanation seemed to have holes in it. As the days went by, the investigation deepened. The hotel's security footage from the night of the murder was examined, and something startling was discovered. Around 2:30 a.m., Sarah was seen leaving the hotel room. She didn't appear panicked or distressed. Instead, she moved with an unsettling calmness, her face stoic and composed. There was no rush to her steps, no sign of the kind of shock one would expect from someone who had just discovered their husband dead in such a violent way. The footage revealed her walking down the hallway, exiting the building, and heading into the parking lot. She was gone for about 20 minutes before re-entering the building. When Sarah returned to the room, there was no visible sign of the chaos that had occurred. She was, by all accounts, calm and collected, far too composed for someone whose life had just been turned upside down. The investigators began to question her actions more closely. Why had she left the room in the middle of the night? Why had she not tried to reach out for help when she first woke up and found Daniel dead? There was an overwhelming sense of doubt growing among the police and the public. Could Sarah have been involved in her husband's death, or was she truly the innocent victim of a tragic and inexplicable event? But there was something more, something the investigators couldn't yet see. The deeper they dug, the more the pieces of Sarah's story seemed to unravel, and the more they suspected that what had happened that night was not as it appeared. As the investigation progressed, a dark truth began to emerge from the shadows, a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about Sarah Matthews. As the investigation into Daniel Rivers' death unfolded, the deeper the authorities dug into Sarah Matthews' life, the more unsettling truths began to emerge. Sarah, who had once been seen as the embodiment of innocence and grace in the small town of Greenfield, was not as flawless as she appeared. Her past, once neatly tucked away, began to unravel piece by piece, revealing a web of deceit, financial trouble, and secrets that no one had ever suspected. It was no secret that Sarah had grown up in a modest home, but she had always projected an image of stability and success. To those who knew her, she was a hard-working teacher, always kind and considerate, and involved in various community activities. But what no one knew was that Sarah had been hiding a significant amount of debt, something she had carefully concealed from everyone around her. Through her work as a teacher, Sarah barely scraped by. Despite her professional demeanor, she had struggled financially for years. There had been credit card bills, loans, and a series of unpaid debts that had slowly built up over time. The weight of her financial troubles was something she had learned to carry quietly, never revealing the true extent of her struggles to anyone, not even her closest friends. It was a part of her life that she hid behind her warm smile and her ever-optimistic attitude. But as the investigation continued, the debts grew impossible to ignore. Records revealed that Sarah had been in contact with Victor Lawrence, a local businessman known for his wealth and influence in the town. He had a reputation for being charismatic but also ruthless when it came to financial matters. Sarah had borrowed money from Victor on more than one occasion, and her debts to him had been growing steadily. At first, their relationship had seemed purely professional, but the more investigators looked into their interactions, the more they began to suspect there was something deeper between them. Victor had provided Sarah with the financial support she desperately needed, but it came at a cost. He had begun to expect things in return. Small favors at first, but as time went on, the stakes grew higher. There were rumors that Victor had more than just a financial interest in Sarah, that he had been guiding her decisions, pressuring her into making certain choices. The nature of their relationship became increasingly suspicious, and it wasn't long before police began to consider Victor as a possible accomplice in the death of Daniel Rivers. In the weeks before the wedding, Sarah had been living in a state of quiet desperation. She had met Daniel at the charity event, and he had been everything she had hoped for. A wealthy, successful man who could provide the life she had always dreamed of. Daniel's charm and ambition had captivated her, and the prospect of marrying him seemed like her ticket out of her financial nightmare. But it wasn't just about money. Sarah was in love with the idea of being with someone who could offer her the stability and security she had never had. And Daniel's wealth was a crucial part of that dream. The more Sarah and Daniel grew closer, the more she began to view their relationship as an opportunity, a way to escape her mounting debts. Victor, ever the puppet master, had encouraged this mindset. He had subtly planted the idea that marrying Daniel would solve all of Sarah's problems. At first she had hesitated, unsure of how to navigate the complicated emotions surrounding her growing feelings for Daniel. But as her debts spiraled out of control, the choice became clearer. The investigation had reached a boiling point when Sarah Matthews was finally brought in for questioning. The authorities, now suspicious of her involvement in Daniel Rivers' death, pressed her for answers. But Sarah's demeanor had changed drastically since that fateful morning. Gone was the terrified woman who had stood outside the hotel room, covered in blood, begging for help. Now she appeared composed, almost detached, as if she were a completely different person. The questioning started with the basics. What had happened that night? But Sarah's answers were increasingly contradictory, her explanations muddled and inconsistent. At first, she had claimed that she had no idea what had transpired, that she had fallen asleep and woken up to find her husband dead. But now, sitting in the stark interrogation room, her story began to change. She spoke with a coldness in her voice, her eyes betraying none of the grief one might expect from a widow. As the hours dragged on, the detectives began to tighten the noose, pushing her on the details. Sarah's story, once so simple, was falling apart. The inconsistencies were glaring. Why had she left the hotel room in the middle of the night? Why hadn't she attempted to call for help when she discovered Daniel's body? Sarah couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation. The more the detectives probed, the more the cracks in her story widened. Finally, under the pressure of relentless questioning, Sarah's defenses crumbled. She confessed. But her confession wasn't what the detectives had anticipated. It wasn't a simple admission of guilt. Instead, Sarah began to unravel a chilling narrative, one that revealed not just her involvement, but the extent to which she had been manipulated. She told them about her financial troubles, her mounting debts, and the desperate steps she had taken to fix them. She spoke of Victor Lawrence, the businessman she had borrowed money from, and how he had become a powerful figure in her life. At first, Victor had seemed like a savior, someone who could pull her from the depths of her financial despair. But over time, his influence had grown more sinister. Victor had planted the idea in Sarah's mind that marrying Daniel could be the key to solving all her problems. He had convinced her that Daniel's wealth would allow her to escape the burden of debt and finally secure a life of comfort. But Sarah's feelings for Daniel had been complicated. She had genuinely cared for him, but the pressure of her debts and Victor's promises had clouded her judgment. Her marriage to Daniel had been a way out, a way to start fresh. But as the wedding night approached, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. Daniel had always been kind and loving, but she knew deep down that he wasn't the man she had hoped him to be. He was possessive, controlling, and as the night wore on, he had become increasingly aggressive. Sarah described the events of the night in chilling detail. After a few hours of celebration, Daniel had become drunk. His demeanor shifted and he grew angry over small things that had never seemed important before. He yelled at her for no reason, his temper flaring in a way that unsettled Sarah. As the night wore on, he became more aggressive, cornering her in their hotel room and making threats. In that moment, Sarah felt trapped, scared, and vulnerable. What had started as a dream wedding night had quickly turned into a nightmare. In a panic, Sarah grabbed a heavy candlestick from the nightstand, using it to defend herself as Daniel advanced toward her. The blow came in a split second, and before she realized what had happened, Daniel was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The reality of what she had done hit her like a wave, but it was too late. Daniel was dead. But Sarah's confession didn't end there. As she recounted the details of the night, she revealed something even more disturbing: Victor's role in the events that led up to Daniel's death. It wasn't just her own desperation that had led to the tragedy. Victor had been manipulating her from the very beginning, subtly encouraging her to marry Daniel for his wealth and to eliminate him if necessary. Victor's control over Sarah had been insidious, and as Sarah spoke, it became clear that she had been a pawn in a much larger, darker scheme. Victor had promised her everything: a life free from financial worry, the freedom to live as she pleased. All she had to do was marry Daniel, and if things didn't work out, eliminate him. Sarah had never intended for things to go that far, but once the situation escalated, she acted in self-defense. However, what seemed like an accident soon became part of a larger plan, a plan she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. The detectives listened in silence as Sarah revealed more about her relationship with Victor and how she had been caught in his web of manipulation. But as the confession came to an end, one question remained unanswered. Had Sarah been a willing participant in Daniel's death, or had she been forced into it by Victor's influence? The truth was murky, and as Sarah's trial approached, the public was left to decide for themselves. The case had taken a dark turn, revealing that Sarah Matthews, the innocent woman everyone thought they knew, was not just a victim, but a woman with a much more complicated and dangerous role in the death of her husband. The trial of Sarah Matthews captivated the town of Greenfield. The once idyllic community where everyone knew everyone else's business was torn apart by the details of the case. The local courtroom was packed every day as townspeople, friends, and family watched the proceedings unfold, trying to make sense of the tragedy. Sarah had once been beloved, admired by all, but now she stood accused of murder. The woman they had known as sweet, gentle, and caring was now being portrayed as someone capable of cold-blooded violence. The air was thick with uncertainty as the trial became a battle for her freedom and for the truth. The prosecution's case against Sarah was damning. They painted her as a woman driven by greed and desperation, willing to murder her new husband to escape her mounting financial troubles. They had found evidence of Sarah's deep debts, her troubling relationship with Victor Lawrence, and the strange circumstances of that night in the hotel room. The security footage from the hotel showed Sarah leaving the room in the middle of the night and returning minutes later with no apparent distress. The prosecution argued that it was clear Sarah had been involved in planning Daniel's death, whether she was acting alone or with someone else's encouragement. Her calm demeanor, they claimed, was the ultimate proof that she had been hiding something from the very start. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Sarah had been a victim of circumstance and manipulation. Her financial troubles had weighed heavily on her, and her marriage to Daniel had initially seemed like a way out. But as her relationship with him progressed, the truth became more difficult to ignore. They argued that Daniel had been abusive, controlling, and manipulative, and that Sarah had been left with no choice but to defend herself in a moment of panic. Sarah's actions, they claimed, were the result of a combination of fear, self-defense, and the pressure she had been under for years. Her calm demeanor in the aftermath of the incident, the defense said, was merely a result of the shock and trauma of the situation. She had never intended for things to escalate the way they did. As the trial continued, more evidence was revealed. The prosecution called upon Victor Lawrence to testify. Victor had been an influential figure in Sarah's life, and his involvement in the case was significant. He spoke of how he had lent Sarah money, how their relationship had deepened over time, and how he had subtly pushed her to marry Daniel. He denied any involvement in Daniel's death, but his testimony only added to the suspicions surrounding Sarah's role in the murder. The prosecution suggested that Victor's influence had been the driving force behind Sarah's actions, even if he hadn't directly participated in the crime. Victor's testimony painted Sarah as someone who had been driven by ambition and the promise of a better life. He admitted that he had encouraged her to marry Daniel, but he denied any knowledge of the murder plan. His words created doubt, however. Was he manipulating her, or had Sarah taken matters into her own hands? The line between victim and accomplice had become blurred, and the jury was left to wrestle with that uncertainty. In the final days of the trial, Sarah took the stand in her own defense. She spoke of her struggles, her overwhelming debts, and her growing anxiety about her future. She confessed to feeling trapped in her marriage to Daniel, but she insisted that she had never wanted to hurt him. She described the events of that night with painful clarity, how Daniel's behavior had become increasingly erratic, how she had felt cornered, and how, in the heat of the moment, she had struck him in self-defense. The jury listened closely, hanging on her every word. Sarah's tearful testimony seemed to resonate with some, while others remained unconvinced. When the defense rested, the case was left in the hands of the jury. As they deliberated, the town waited with bated breath. The outcome of the trial would not only determine Sarah's fate, but it would also decide the truth of what had happened on that fateful wedding night. Was Sarah truly a victim who had been pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond her control? Or was she a woman who had acted out of cold calculation, willing to kill for a chance at a better life? Days passed, and the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge prepared to announce the decision. Sarah stood, her hands trembling, her face a mask of uncertainty. The judge's voice echoed in the silent room as the words were spoken. "We find the defendant, Sarah Matthews, guilty of second-degree murder." The gasp that rippled through the room was deafening as the reality of the verdict set in. Sarah's fate was sealed. She had been convicted, but the sentence was not as severe as the prosecution had hoped. The jury had found that while Sarah had been guilty of killing Daniel, her actions had been driven by fear and the extreme pressures of her life. The judge sentenced her to a reduced prison term, taking into account her emotional state and the manipulative influence of Victor Lawrence.